I guess I get. Now we're on. We are recording, they tell me. Welcome, everyone. Excited to be here for our first one of 2021. I think I'm most excited that it is 2021 and we got a fresh start. So as we kick off the meeting, if we could first start with everyone joining me and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Especially proud to be doing that after we had the hosted the funeral for the Sacramento County Sheriff's Deputy yesterday, and our patriotism was in full force with down the street, and it makes you feel pretty darn good. If we could start with roll call, Annette, if you would call us to order.
Sure, thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I call roll. Just a reminder, as previously announced, that this meeting is being recorded. It will be posted on our SACOG website for future viewing. For any of our committee members, if you would like to make a comment during the meeting, we ask that you use the raise hand feature so that we can keep track of your comments. I'll go ahead and start roll. Director Baines. Looks like he's absent. Houlihan. Absent. Clark Kretz.
Here.
Frost.
Here.
Gore. Absent. Harris.
Here.
New.
Here.
West.
Here.
Vice Chair Kennedy.
Here.
And Chair Gallardo.
Here.
Thank you.
Well, I thought we'd take a moment and introduce our new folks, but I think, Jan, have you've met this group before? I think that's the only one that's here. I think, Jan, you're our only our newbie.
Yeah, well, today is my first lunar meeting, which I'm excited to even be involved with anything like that. So nice to meet everybody. I'm from the town of Loomis and excited to be here.
Welcome.
We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our action items, and our first action item is approval of the minutes. If everyone had an opportunity to review that was here. Oh, and I apologize. I got to do public comments first. And you did mention, do we have any member of the public online calling in? And any public, Lynette?
I'm sorry about that. There is no public comment.
Thank you. And we'll move on to the action item for the minutes. And if everyone has had an opportunity to review those, if not, any questions, if I can get a motion.
New moves for approval.
Thank you. Give a motion by Director New. Do I have a second?
Frost, second.
Thank you, Director Frost. Motion approved, a motion and a second. All those in favor? Do we need to do a roll call, Lynette, for minutes?
We do. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
If you're ready for that.
We're ready.
Okay. Director Baines. Absent. Houlihan. She'll be joining us shortly. Absent. Clark Kretz.
Abstain. I wasn't here last time.
Frost.
Aye.
Gore.
Aye.
Harris.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
West.
Aye.
Vice Chair Kennedy.
Aye.
And Chair Gallardo.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. We're going to move on to item number 2, and this is discussion about the charge for our committee, and Clint Wilson will be leading us in this discussion.
Good afternoon. So this is your first action for the year. It'll be to recommend that our board adopt the committee charge, laying out the committee's purview and the kind of the key priority areas for the next 12 months. So those of you that were at the orientation, you already got a pretty good run through of what's coming in the year ahead. Those of you that are veterans to this committee, there's not a lot that's different this year over last year, but we've got some cool and key initiatives coming coming to you, many of which you'll hear about today in our very first meeting. So this committee oversees SACOG's work related to housing, air quality, climate change, water resources and flood protection, and agriculture. It's a wide range of things that we'll cover in this committee. This year is a really big year for housing, with your local jurisdictions working on housing elements. We'll be talking quite a bit this year about how we can tackle the housing crisis that we're seeing across the state, but that we're absolutely seeing here in the SACOG region. You'll get a little bit of a discussion today from Dov Caden on the housing work facing us this year. You'll also be hearing from Jennifer Hargrove, our program lead for some state housing money that is coming through the region. This is the first time that we've had this type of money to award coming through the Regional Council of Governments. And so that program will be returning here next month, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that as we go ahead. Today, you'll hear from Renee DeVere Oki on some success we've had recently in acquiring grants to help conserve and protect and enhance our agricultural lands, and SACOG received a grant. So we're just launching a new initiative called our Coordinated Rural Opportunity Planning effort this year. You'll hear about that through your information items today. This committee also oversees the work that SACOG does as the Airport Land Use Commission. And Greg Chu is here today to talk about the very first action that our board is faced with, updating a land use compatibility plan for Mather Airport in Sacramento County. You'll hear about that today as well. And then not hearing about this today, but it is absolutely something that will be coming to this committee throughout the year. Our long range transportation plan, our sustainable community strategy, that effort will be gearing up this year. It feels like we just adopted it, but we update this every 4 years, and that process takes quite a bit of time and effort. So that is something that primarily in the second half of this year will be a recurring theme for this committee. So those are kind of the really quick highlights of what you'll have coming to you in the year ahead. Like I said, you'll hear from our project and program leads today on a good number of these things. But by the time we get through this spring, you'll have, I think you'll have received pretty good background on all of the things overseen by this committee. So this is an action item to adopt this charge. I'm happy to respond to any questions or any comments that anybody might have.
Thank you. As you guys can see, it's a pretty all-encompassing charge that we have. And I know it can look a little overwhelming, but we take a chunk at a time. And are there any questions right now for Clint on this information? Not seeing any hands up. You must have covered it well then. Lynette, do we have any public comment on this item?
No public comment.
Okay. There we are. No more questions, no public comment, any other comments from our directors? If not, then I will be looking for a motion.
New will move for approval.
Thank you, Director New. Is there a second?
I'll say
West is second.
Thank you. You're good. I think that was Director Clark Kretz. I think if I'm guessing. Thank you. No other questions, no other public comment, then we can move forward with a vote.
Great, thank you. Director Baines? Absent. Boulahan? Absent. Clark Kretz?
yes.
Frost?
Yes.
Gore?
Aye.
Harris?
Yes.
New?
Aye.
West?
Yes.
Vice Chair Kennedy?
Aye.
Chair Gallardo?
Yes.
And it looks like Director Boulahan is here and raising her hand. If I could just check. Director Boulahan, are you there? Are you voting aye on this item?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. And can I put you down as an aye vote on this item?
Which item was that? I just like barely got on.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you need to abstain, that's fine. It's the Land Use and Natural Resources Committee charge.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I'll just aye on that one.
Okay, thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. Okay, one of the interesting charges we have is the land use compatibility for our airports. And we are going to move on to an information item, and Gregory Chu from the staff will be joining us on this item, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Chair Gallo. Greg Chu, I'm on the planning staff here at SACOG, and one of the things that we do at SACOG and that you do as a board is we serve as what's called the Airport Land Use Commission. What I'm here to do today is give you a little bit of background about just what your role is. It doesn't come up often, even though we have a couple of new members. This is completely new. Even our existing members, we don't have many items that come before the SACOG board as the Airport Land Use Commission. So what today is going on is we'll give a little background about what your role is as the Airport Land Use Commission, and then specifically what's been going on with Mather Airport. And then this is just an information item for you today, but the board later this month will be asked to take an action item. So I can ask Katie to move the next slide, please. Okay, so what is the Airport Land Use Commission? Its purpose is to make sure that the lands surrounding airports are compatible uses with the airports in the region. This was a result of, for those that were here in the early 70s in this region, there was a bad plane crash off of Executive Airport and Freeport Boulevard in Sacramento. The pilot had a heart attack just as he was about to fly and had a heart attack and flew right into a Farrell's ice cream parlor on a Saturday in the summer with a ice cream parlor full of kids, killed about 35 people. As a result, the state wanted to look at this and say, hey, we need to think about whether or not we have compatible uses near airports. It provided, the state legislature came up with a law and said we need to just look at this, and then it delegated the powers to the Council of Governments throughout the state, including SACOG here. And that's specifically to coordinate airport compatibility planning around the airports. So what happens is we develop some policies, we look at specific airports one at a time, and then we adopt what's called the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan, or ALUCP. What happens is once those plans are adopted, and ultimately the SACOG board serving as the Airport Land Use Commission is the one who adopts it, then we review local plans and development projects near airports to make sure they're consistent. So SACOG serves at the Airport Land Use Commission for 4 counties, Sacramento, Sutter, Yuba, and Yolo counties. El Dorado is its own Airport Land Use Commission, and Placer County is its own Airport Land Use Commission. Next slide, please. So what the board will be asked to do, it's started some time ago with the process to develop the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan for Mather Airport. And we're now in the middle of that process. And the board, there'll be 3 public comment periods, and we'll be in the second one that'll be coming to the board later this month. But what's an Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan? Is to make sure that future land uses are compatible with airport operations. And we specifically look at noise to make sure how noise affects people. There's certain sensitive uses that you don't want near an airport or too close to an airport, such as hospitals and schools. Safety, same thing. You don't want to build high rises off the end of runways. And we also look at height, such as cell towers and any other sort of issues. And we also want to notify people that are possibly thinking of building or buying property near an airport. So the key distinction here is SACOG is not the airport operator. What we're required to do is compatibility to land surrounding the airports. This program does not have anything to do with airport operations or any aviation management or anything that goes on to the airport property itself. We work in tandem with the airport operators. Next slide, please. So specifically what happens is the main thing that the board does is it adopts these plans for each of, we have 16 airports in the 4 counties, and we adopt policies and then the ALUCP for each airport. As staff, we're working with all the local agencies that are affected by this. We're looking at individual applications and we review those near the airports, and we work with your local staffs, cities and counties for those projects. And then we make determination recommendations that go to the board, and we coordinate with Caltrans staff. Caltrans is the overseeing body that we report to. They have a department just on airports that we report to make sure for statewide consistency. Next slide, please. So from a local jurisdiction standpoint, for the cities and counties in the 4 counties, they update their land use plans consistent with the ALUCP. We work in tandem with them. So it's not we do what we think that has to happen. We're working with them to talk about what their plans are to make sure we have some consistency, and if there's ways that we can tweak things on both sides to make it work, we do that. We work with, again, Caltrans and the local agencies, and then local agencies also submit development applications to us for review. And sometimes there's reasons why a project, local jurisdiction really wants a project. So a governing body, a city council or board of supervisors may override with a 2/3 vote. That's written in the state law. Next slide, please. So why are we updating Mather? So we try to update these plans about every 15 or 20 years. It's about right time for Mather to be updated. 1997 when it was last done. What also happened is Sacramento County Department of Airports owns and operates Mather Airport, and they updated their master plan. Their master plan is operations and how flights come in and how often they go and so forth. So because they updated their plans, and there's been a lot of changes in the types of planes and how, whether or not they're quieter or what approaches they come into the airport, that's all part of the master plan. Because those operations have changed, we want to adjust what is compatible around the airport. And there's a lot of new development that's going on surrounding this airport. So we were requested and are working in tandem with the Sacramento County Department of Airports. They're paying for SACOG's time as well as the project consultant's time. Next slide, please. So what's in the airport land use compatibility plan? So we have general policies about safety and noise and so forth. We have compatibility factors. I'll show you a slide in a second. So we have these different factors that we consider when we look at compatibility with airports: noise, safety, airspace protection, that's really height, and then overflight notification, that's if noise could bother you. Next slide, please. So this would be a graphic example of what happens is the airport, you can see the runway on the bottom there where it says safety. So the state has guidelines for what these zones are. We have different zones, and the closer it gets to the bottom, the more intense it is. So safety zones is the #1 thing. Like I was mentioning, Farrell's ice cream, that would have been in a zone that would not have normally been allowed for development to happen. So we have different safety zones, and different uses are allowed depending on how close they are to the end of the runway. And there's a lot of statistical science about where crashes are likely to happen, and we try to accommodate for that. And again, we get guidance from the state. We also have different noise zones that happen, and we measure those. The county updates those periodically, and then those are reflected. Then we have airspace protection. That's height issues. There's certain places where you don't want tall structures. And then overflight areas are just if people are affected by the noise. Next slide, please. So here's an example of noise, which is the most one of the 2 most important. This shows the noise contours for for Mather Airport. The closer it is, the louder it's going to be. There's certain areas where we don't want residential to be, and we lay it out. In the next slide, please. What we do is we take those different noise contours and show the table, and we have the different contours and then what's allowed depending on what the land use is in each zone. Next slide, please. We do the same thing for safety. This is the safety zone based on the state's guidance. And again, the closer it is to the end of the runway, the less likely we're going to allow densities of people to be in. Next slide, please. So we've been working for Mather Airport with all the surrounding agencies that are affected by it, particularly the city of Rancho Cordova, Sacramento County Planning, City of Folsom. El Dorado County is interested in this, and then we have a couple of school districts, and then the Department of Aeronautics. So they're the ones helping us develop the plan. Why don't you go to the next slide, please? So where we're at, we're in the middle of the process now. As I mentioned, there's 3 different public review comment periods. The first one took place in September. That's the last time the board and this committee had a discussion about this. What it did was the board approved letting the draft plan go out for public comment. So now we're going to be coming back to the board in a couple of weeks, and we will relay the comments that we received during that period of time. We've also done an initial displacement analysis. So if we adopt the plan, what would it mean in terms of displacement of people living around the airport? And then we have the accompanying environmental document. So in 2 weeks, you'll get the review of what the ALUC is on the first 3 bullets there about the role and Mather and what the public review process is. And then as a board, as serving as the Airport Land Use Commission, you'll be asked to release for public comment our analysis on displacement and then the environmental document. That'll be a 30-day public period comment if the board approves it. And then we will come back as staff in April or May to wrap it up. And depending on what sort of comments we get on the plan and the analysis and the environmental document, then we will take the appropriate action from there. Next slide, please. So here's basically what's been going on. This process has been going on since 2018 as far as getting the consultant project going. And the last action was in September by the board. And then again, the process that I just mentioned. So April or May would be the final action by the board. So final slide, please. So I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have.
I've got a quick.
I think Chair Gaiello is still on mute.
That would be helpful, wouldn't it? Any questions for Greg from the directors?
Yes. I'm trying, I raised my hand, and now I'm trying to lower it and it won't work. However, Greg, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Curious to know the displacement, if you could elaborate on displacement a little bit for me.
So we have an existing airport land use compatibility plan now. And when we look at displacement, we're looking at if we were to adopt the proposed plan as we had publicly released it back in September, what would it mean to, would we be moving people out in places in large numbers? Would the net effect be roughly the same? We would look at it on a parcel by parcel basis. So the consultant has been looking at that and analyzes that effect, that impact.
So the possibility exists, we would by our decision, we would have require people to move?
By your decision, you would allow us to release the displacement analysis so that the public can review what it says in there. ultimately, when perhaps by April or later, then the plan would be adopted. But I think your question is would people have to move? If you're an existing land use, you remain there. You're allowed
Okay.
in. You're an existing.
That's all that's really want.
Yeah.
If we're
It's only-
analyzing how many people we're going to have to displace, that would kind of concern me, but okay, I'm with you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Director Clark Kretz.
Thank you. I think you mentioned, I saw a bullet point that El Dorado County was interested, and I just wanted to know what was their interest.
Historically, there had been some past operations that the airport had done that people in El Dorado County had been contacting Sacramento County Department of Airports about on flight operations. With the update to the master plan and changes in operations, I believe those issues have been resolved. But as a courtesy, we contacted the county planning and they participated in this. They made their say and they've been involved with the process since the beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Gore.
Thanks. Just a quick question. So at our meeting on February 18th, will we have an opportunity to see the plan, or will it be after it's released that we have the opportunity to see the plan?
So the plan was released back in September. That's when the board allowed us to release it. That's still on the SACOG website.
It's on the website. So that's where I can go look at it. Okay.
But we got comments on that. And then what we're asking to do is release the analysis that goes with it and anything else that happens with that. So we're asking for an opportunity to get feedback on the next stage of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question, and you went over it, and I apologize. It was so quick, I didn't catch it all. But on our purview of airports, you said 16 airports. Can you? But there were some that are not ours in our area.
So SACOG serves 6 counties, not 4. But for the Airport Land Use Commission, we're designated 4 of those counties: Sacramento, Sutter, Yuba, and Yolo. El Dorado is its own. Its El Dorado Transportation Commission serves as the Airport Land Use Commission for that county, and then the Placer County Transportation Agency serves as it in Placer County. So very similar issues. We communicate occasionally and share notes, but we here at SACOG, we are only the 4 counties.
And I can't help but think, and I remember as a kid, the horrific Farrell's accident, but I also think about every time you fly into San Diego and you literally fly past the windows of the office buildings and wave to the people inside. When did these new regulations come into play? Was it from the Farrell's time, or was that, I'm just curious how they were able to build so close.
Well, so it's been in effect since the late 70s. And then, yeah, there's lots of interpretations about, different aircraft and airport operations and so forth. So some of these are controversial, particularly the ones down south, because you have a lot of density surrounding those airports.
Yeah, and I think the same with Placer, which is not our purview, but I know we just lost one of our council members, but it seems like that's fairly not as rare as it should be, I guess, in that area. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? If not, I would open up for public comment. Lynette, do we have any public comment on this item?
No public comment.
Public comment? And we are not looking for any action at this time. This was just information, correct?
That's correct. However, the board will be asked to release the items that I mentioned earlier.
Great. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I just thought it might be, especially with a lot of our first committee meeting of the year, a lot of our new members. I wanted Kirk Trost just to weigh in here for a second. Greg did an excellent presentation, but as the Land Use Natural Resources Committee, right, to step back, as you know, all of you as local governments have land use authority, right? And what we do here at SACOG is typically try to work with you and your staff in the private sector to encourage more growth and development, higher densities, higher intensities. This is one area in which we are given powers by the state to actually discourage land use. And your questions are all really good, right? The displacement question from Director Harris. So I was wondering, Kirk, could just so we're all clear on what your job and your role is here, say a few more things, just so we get some clarity for the board.
Yeah, sure. It was a good question by Director Harris about what does displacement analysis mean in this context, and you're going to see it when this comes to the board. But the issue isn't replacing people in their current position. It's looking at the underlying zoning and underlying development potential for land around the airport, and what is the impact of the land use plan that is being proposed on that potential for future development, right? Because you might have land that is zoned for development right now, and this new plan might come out and say, you know what, we really shouldn't be developing in those areas. And so that's the kind of displacement analysis that's looked at, because that has an impact on the region, right? If you take out development opportunities in one place, we need to think about where else it's going to go. The other thing is, and James, you make a really good point, Greg, it's hard for me to remember when we've had kind of a disagreement between the ALUCP and a jurisdiction about where development should occur, but it can happen. And the plan doesn't absolutely stop development from occurring in those places. But if a local jurisdiction does want to override the determination that's made in the plan, they can do so, but it has to happen by a supermajority of the local jurisdiction, after you've had an opportunity to consult with us, to look at the plan and determine whether that's the right thing to go on in your own jurisdiction. So those are the two issues that I think are important to highlight going forward.
And I will say, I think there are some challenges, right, even around Mather, but some of the others where as we grow as a region, we are going to begin to have conflicts. And we want some really good, smart growth developments to happen in the vicinity of airports. And so, anyway, you're going to be wrestling with this issue, I think, just because of how many airports we have and how much growth we want in some of these areas. So we have to balance that.
With that additional information, any other questions? Thank you. We will move on to item number 4 then. It looks like Renee is going to be talking to us about our grant awards and on agricultural lands.
All right, good afternoon. Renee DeVarioki from your planning staff. As Clint mentioned, I'll be covering a prior year grant funding opportunity, as well as covering a future item that's going to be coming to this committee and that we'll be looking for your input on in the future. So to start off, I just wanted to go over a little bit of background on what we call RUCs before we jump into the details of the item. So this term may be familiar to many of you already, but just in shorthand, so the Rural Urban Connection Strategy, that's what we call RUCs. It's our favorite acronym, and you'll hear it pop up in relation to STACOG's approach to rural lands and communities, and particularly their connections with our urban environments. So what is our interest in rural lands? A few quick facts, and these are always kind of interesting. So approximately 80% of the land in the MTP is actually designated for ag, open space, or timber use. So that's a good fact for you to have in your head as we go through this. Also, of that 80%, 40% is actually for agriculture. And as you know, our region has deep history in ag. We have a lot of the most productive farmland in the world. And it's actually a $2 billion and growing dollar industry within the 6-county region, and something that we rely on heavily. So the RUCs program is really aimed at recognizing and enhancing rural economies and our natural assets. Think working lands and how these uses help us to create products and jobs, not only in rural communities, but also in our urban environments as well. So moving forward, RUCs is going to be taking the shape of a coordinated rural opportunities plan, so what we're calling CROP. And this is going to be helping to highlight our economic prosperity strategy related to food, ag, and technology. So noting our region's vested interest in ag, we as staff do monitor and highlight programs or grant sources to this committee, which should be of interest, and particularly funding sources. So last year, when we came to this group, we were highlighting a program of interest from the Department of Conservation, which is taking me to today's item. So the results of the Strategic Agricultural Land Conservation Program. So true to this name, it's a program that funds the development of local and regional land use policies and economic development strategies to protect critical lands in the form of planning grants. It also has a second component, which is ag conservation easements, and this is through voluntary permanent agricultural conservation easements or fee title purchases. So cycle 6 of the SALC program, or the Strategic Agricultural Land Conservation Program, that wrapped up this past December. So some good news is that the SAGHOG region received roughly 3.8 million of the grant funds that were available. There was about 52 million in cap and trade funds. And so this was in the form of 2 conservation easement grants. So there was one that went to the California Range Trust for $2.6 million. This was in Sacramento County. It's a 600-acre ranch near Rancho Murrieta. The second grant went to the city of Davis in partnership with the YOLO Land Trust, and they received $701,000. And this went to a 124-acre agricultural easement, part of a 154-acre farm, and located over on the north edge of Davis. So in your attachment A for this item, you can see some additional information on those projects, as well as their locations and maps. Now, on the programming side of the project, the plan side, SAGHOG received $250,000 to develop a coordinated rural opportunity plan. So that's what we're calling our crop project. And then Yolo County also receives $250,000 to do a agricultural conservation priority plan. And we worked with Yolo staff to coordinate our grant applications. And so we'll be working with them as we move forward, as well as the other 5 counties. So important for this committee is our crop project, because that's the one we'll be coming back forward with over the course of the next year. So crop aims to elevate local conservation, economic development, and planning efforts by uniting them in a cohesive regional strategy. The intention of which is basically to help all of you and our other partners compete for grants and secure other available funding to preserve, support, and expand critical agricultural infrastructure and services. So attachment B is a FAQ that provides a quick highlight overview of the project and some of the partners that'll be part of that. So of note, we'll be convening a 6-county working group. We're looking for agricultural and planning staff. We will be holding 4 meetings over the next year and a half, and we'll be looking for the 6-county group to help us guide the project. We'll also be going to each county and holding several county-specific meetings with larger group of stakeholders. And what we want to do is utilize these groups to help zero in on barriers, strategies, identification of priority investment needs, opportunities to keep agricultural lands productive and profitable. So we'll be looking both from a regional lens as well as a local lens, and using this as to help expand our base case for supporting agricultural economies. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be starting in April, and I am actually in the early phases of reaching out to your staff who helped us conceptualize this project, as well as provided us letters of support and commitments to help us move forward with the project. So we'll be starting in April and carrying on through June of 2022. And then we'll be coming out and giving updates to this group as we hit critical milestones. And so with that, I'm going to pause for any questions that you have. And I'm also interested in hearing from you if you have any recommended stakeholders, groups, plans, contacts, where you feel that we should start reaching out to as we begin initial research and before we start our outreach efforts. And if you think of any after this committee, you can always reach out to me, Clint or Lynette, and we'll be sure to include those in our efforts going forward. So with that, I'll pause.
Thank you. Any questions on this item? I don't see any hands raised. Lynette, any questions from the public on this item?
No public comment.
Thank you. We will look forward to hearing the next step, and I appreciate the information. Okay, we're going to move on to item number 5, which is our implementation activities, and Jennifer Hargrove will be leading us through this item.
Afternoon. I'm Jennifer Hargrove, one of your planning staff here at SAGHOG. This item is to inform the committee on the various land use related activities that staff participates in on a monthly basis. So starting next month, this item will be receive and file in your packet every month. So you won't have a staff presentation like this every month. But since it is the first committee of the year, we wanted to take a moment and introduce you to the item and why you received this summary of activities every month. So 20 years ago, roughly, 2001, our region was dealing with worsening air quality as well as increasing traffic concerns. And here at SACOG at that time, we were updating our transportation plan as we do every 4 years. And we were looking at the billions of dollars of transportation investment that we were planning for in the next 20 years. And seeing that our modeling was showing increasing congestion and worsening air quality. So, you know, how could that be? How could we be planning to invest billions and billions of dollars into that future? We knew something had to change, and we realized that we couldn't just plan for transportation investment without regard for land use. We needed to understand where and how the region was growing in order to better plan for that future transportation needs of the region, and also to more efficiently use public dollars. So in 2002, we launched the Blueprint, a transportation and land use study, looking at how the region might grow in 50 years and what the transportation impact that could have. The Blueprint taught us that land use, transportation, and air quality are inextricably linked, and that utilizing smart growth principles and planning for land use and transportation together would actually result in the positive outcomes that we all want for the region. So fast forward then to 2008 and our first long-range transportation plan post-Blueprint. We took what we learned from the Blueprint, we worked with member agencies and created a land use forecast as well as the transportation project investments. And modeling that plan showed a future with more housing choice, more agricultural land being preserved, more natural resources being conserved, a reduced vehicle travel, significantly improved air quality, and for the first time, a future with reduced congestion. So now every 4 years, we repeat that planning process, and our long-range transportation plan and sustainable community strategy, the MTP-SCS, are very much an inclusive plan looking at not just the transportation investments, but also that land use forecast, where and how we're growing in the next 20 years. We do that planning work in close collaboration with all of your staff, as well as our partners and our stakeholders, because we know that we are not the only agency responsible for implementation. In fact, on the land use side, as James noted earlier, we have no responsibility for the implementation on that side. How and where we grow is very much a local jurisdiction, within local jurisdiction control. So we very much depend on local implementation efforts, and therefore we really want to prioritize and support all of those local efforts that cities and counties are doing to implement smart growth and the Blueprint and our long-range transportation plan and sustainable community strategy. So that brings me back to this item. Every month we use this report to inform this committee of any land use related activities that we have engaged in to support that local implementation. The types of activities that you'll typically see in this report include a few things. First, any project analysis or letters that we've written on development projects will be listed here. And we do that type of analysis or project letters at the request of the local jurisdiction. Second, any presentations we've made or meetings we've convened related to land use development or housing will also be summarized here. And last, any technical assistance that we've provided, which could also include short summaries on any of our various grant activities, particularly if the committee isn't hearing a more substantive update on a grant during that month, we'll use this item to give a brief update on what's been happening. So that's what you can expect to see in the item every month, and a little bit of the background on the why. There's no action for you on this item. We really just wanted to make the committee aware of this monthly summary, and briefly connect, briefly explain how it connects to our work here at a very high level. In your staff report, I provided more information on the background about the blueprint and our long-range transportation plan and sustainable community strategy. As Clint noted, you'll be hearing a lot about that throughout the rest of the year in this committee as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions about this, and I will turn it back to you, Chair Gore.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee on this item? Don't see any hands raised. I just have one. You mentioned that you do a letter at the jurisdiction's request. So I'm assuming you just do it in support of an item if staff reaches out to you. Do you ever do something on your own to say, yeah, that's not a project that we support?
Sorry about that. Typically, sorry, I don't know why I'm hearing some feedback on my end, but if it's a specific development project, that is always at the request of the jurisdiction. We will, during open public comment periods on larger planning efforts like general plans or specific plans in a community, SACOG will often provide comments during the open public comment period on those types of activities. But if it's a specific development project, unless we've been routed to it, alerted to it by the local agency or requested to weigh in, we typically don't.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee?
Chair Gale,
yes.
You don't mind me being a bit of a tour guide for this first meeting, and I promise I won't. I will today, but I won't.
Please do.
Single committee meeting. I promise you, you'll get tired of it very soon. And again, really for our new members, and even for some of our returning board members, the blueprint is one of the most special things about this region. And you really need to understand how unique this was nationally, that local governments, this is kind of Green Means Go is maybe one of our latest iterations of this, how local governments came together and said, wait, that's our future? That's not good. We've got to change the way we do things. We've got to change the way we grow. We've got to actually think regionally about this. They came together voluntarily through the blueprint, one of the most remarkable outreach efforts I think we've seen. I heard about this back on the East Coast, down in the Bay Area. You spawned other blueprints all over the country. And, but it's been a while, right? That was 2004, 2005. So I think it's a good to get a refresher. As Jennifer was just saying, and she is among many of our resident experts on this. While we don't control land use, you have that authority. We absolutely have analysis and want you to look to us for analysis on development projects, and we provide that analysis. We weigh in particular, against maybe some of these controversial projects, higher density housing. SACOG takes a very active role. We try to be very thoughtful about that relationship we have with our local government members, but we are one of the most active cogs in the country on this. And I want you to understand and know that that's really an asset for you to use. Sometimes we might provide analysis that you might have questions about. And that's also part of the nature of this, but it is try to make sure we stick to the blueprint and we remember what this region kind of saw as its future back 15 years ago and try to stick to that. That's still, we try to carry that torch and hold it near and dear. I know many of your general plans were actually shaped by the blueprint after the blueprint was adopted. And I want to put the finer point. It becomes a receive and file item in all of your committees, as Jennifer said. I read it diligently every month when it comes through, because it's really fascinating and interesting and helpful to see, right, all of these ways in which we are trying to weigh in on the implementation of the blueprint, if that makes sense.
No, I think it helps a ton. And as a reminder to all of us, whether we've been here for a while or we just walked in the door. So thank you very much. Okay, this is our next information item is we get to do our role in regional planning. So I believe it looks like Dove Caden is going to be doing this on the SACOG role in housing, fair housing.
Will be, thank you. And I'm just pulling up the PowerPoint here. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. So good afternoon, committee members. My name is Dov Caden. I work on the planning team here at SACOG. At our board meeting this month, we're going to be having a workshop on the intersection between land use policy and racial inequality. We have an excellent speaker, Stephen Menendian, who's the policy director at the UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute. And Dr. Menendian is going to cover more of the research side of things, but just as a means of introducing the topic, I'm going to provide a bit of background, some of the history, and some context around why SACOG is engaging on this issue in the first place. So our region is racially diverse, but that diversity is still segregated across cities and neighborhoods. So this is a racial dot density map. I know it's a little hard to see at the regional level. So here's a zoom of the core of Sacramento, where you can pretty clearly see that the sort of wider neighborhoods, which are denoted here in blue, sort of stand out. And in many ways, our cities and our neighborhoods are more segregated by race today than any time in our history. And unfortunately, housing policy has had a role in that. This is the redlining map in Sacramento. It's created by the federal government to provide home loans starting in the New Deal era. Entire books have been written about this era of housing policy, so I won't be able to cover everything on it, but just a couple points to note. The first is that non-white households were legally excluded from what were thought as the high demand neighborhoods that are denoted in here as green or blue neighborhoods through racial covenants. So for example, these were legally enforceable. The Elmhurst neighborhood, as an example in Sacramento, it's one of the blue neighborhoods denoted there, had a covenant that read, "No persons of any race other than white or Caucasian shall use or occupy any structure except for domestic servants." So then a second thing to note, and I think this is probably how most folks think about redlining, non-white households were denied home loans in the red areas. And that's where most people of color lived at the time. And they were denied these loans because the government thought that these were riskier loans due to a neighborhood's racial composition. So as an example, in the top left corner in West Sacramento, the Washington neighborhood was redlined, noting that, quote, "The particular hazard is racial and that infiltration of subversive races has occurred." So as a result of this type of practice between 1934 and 1962, 98% of government-backed loans went to white households. So fortunately, these practices were eventually found unconstitutional, but the effects are still being felt today. Wealth data is not income, but wealth data is extremely difficult to come by. We don't have it broken down at the regional level here, but this is national data from 2019 showing that white households have about 8 times the median wealth of Black households. And there's been quite a bit of research on this racial wealth gap, and it largely indicates that housing equity and appreciation of that housing is a major contributor to this gap, and that intergenerational wealth transfers, so basically inheriting property and money, can actually make this gap extremely durable. So this gap has been in place for a very long time, and unfortunately, even in the last 2 decades, it has actually gotten larger. So another factor at play here is that yes, redlining is illegal, but we didn't we didn't exactly just jump from the more sort of explicit racist policies to fully inclusive land use policy. And instead, cities and counties across the country put in place zoning practices that exclude by income. And so when we look at how the most desirable, the green and the blue neighborhoods from the redlining map before, the ones that had those racial covenants, and we look at how are they zoned today. This is data from the SACOG region that we were able to pull. They're zoned exclusively for single family homes. You can't build more than a single family home on them. And the former redline neighborhoods towards the right there are where you start to see the multifamily and the non-residential zoning. And that would include industrial and sort of other uses that are often thought of as nuisances. So while we no longer employ that sort of explicitly racial zoning or redlining, much of our region and especially our most desirable neighborhoods exclude more affordable housing types. And as a result, they remain relatively white and wealthy. And yes, much of our region as we know it today did not even exist during redlining, right? There's a reason I was sort of focused in on City of Sacramento on that redlining map, because that was sort of the extent of Sacramento at the time. But the development patterns that were created across the region by single family zoning and more restrictive zoning have led to the same exclusion by race and class that was seen in that Sacramento core. And just to be clear, this is not something that is unique to our region, right? This exists across most of the country, and it's so prevalent that the initial intention is not actually that obvious, because there's just so much inertia from doing something the same way for 80 years. And so why does that zoning matter? This chart is showing average income in the SACOG region by the type of housing that the household lives in. And as you might expect, folks with higher incomes who can't afford it tend to live in detached single family homes. And folks with lower incomes tend to live in more affordable housing products, right? So attached housing like townhomes, fourplexes, and larger apartments. And then it's important to note here, fourplexes and apartments, right? Those are illegal to build in upwards of 93% of the residentially designated land in the SACOG region. So we've sort of set up a system where we zone for housing that is expensive and often out of reach on the vast majority of our land. So just to put a bow on the logical chain that I was sort of laying out there, the original zoning ordinances combined with the racial covenants and the redlining were fairly explicitly racist in their intent. These policies are partly responsible for wealth disparities by race because non-white households couldn't take advantage of the subsidized mortgages and the property appreciation that white households were afforded at the time. And this generational windfall for white families really helped create what we commonly think of as the American middle class, right? It built the foundation for these big intergenerational investments like a college education for their children. And this was a windfall that just simply was not afforded to non-white households. And then when redlining and racial covenants were deemed unconstitutional, housing policy shifted from that explicit segregation by race to segregation by income via that restrictive zoning. And so by banning other housing types in the vast majority of those high demand, often wider neighborhoods, it meant that households who could not afford to purchase a single family house, which is inherently more expensive, right? It has larger unit sizes, typically has higher land consumption. Those folks were shut out of certain neighborhoods. And then the key point in black there, which Dr. Menendian at our board workshop will be diving much deeper into at the board workshop, because non-white households couldn't build wealth through housing, restrictive zoning reinforces both economic and racial segregation, and it actually inhibits non-white households from accessing these high demand neighborhoods. And the research is showing that regardless of its current intent, current housing policy is reinforcing that racial wealth gap, and it is to a certain extent reinforcing some of these racial disparities that we we started talking about last board workshop at the Regional Progress Report. So what does all that have to do with SACOG? Well, for one, coming out of the work last year with the SACOG Race Equity and Inclusion Working Group, we have a racial equity framework that lays the foundation for a sustained effort to address the racial inequalities that are associated with some of the policy areas within SACOG's purview. Of course, housing and land use, you heard from Clint, are certainly one of those things that we touch. In addition to that voluntary effort, though, by SACOG, we also wanted to highlight that SACOG actually has a statutory obligation to think about these issues. It was the result of actually a couple bills that were passed in 2018, and these bills enshrine in state law an obligation for public agencies, including SACOG, but also local governments, to administer their programs in a manner that what's called affirmatively furthers fair housing. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, it's a tongue twister when you say it out loud, and it has a sort of long winding definition in statute that you can see on the screen. The basic idea, though, is that it's not enough to make the sort of explicitly discriminatory policies illegal. It requires us to take proactive steps to actually overcome these patterns of segregation and remove some of the barriers that restrict access to opportunity. So one of the first planning processes that this new rule was incorporated into at SACOG was the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, or RHNA, which is another weird acronym, but this is one of SACOG's key functions as a council of government. I know we have some RHNA veterans on this committee, but for the new board members, I'll just provide a very quick overview here. RHNA it's a state mandated planning process. It's been around for decades. It's intended to ensure that California is zoning enough land at different densities just to house everybody that we need to. And it's a three-step process. It starts with the state, and they provide every region a total number of units that the region needs to plan for. And then regions like SACOG are then responsible for developing a methodology for actually distributing that number to each city and county. So we wrapped up that step already. The SACOG board adopted our RHNA plan last March. And the final step, that last arrow, is cities and counties are responsible for adopting a housing element that demonstrates how they can accommodate their RHNA in their zoning. And that is happening right now as we speak. When SACOG was developing the RHNA methodology, there was a whole suite of objectives that we needed to demonstrate to the state that we were actually accomplishing. Affirmatively furthering fair housing was one of those objectives. It was sort of added as a new one. It was the first time any region in the state was actually tackling it. Because of the timing, we often become the guinea pigs for new policy. This was no exception. So how did we translate that somewhat abstract definition that you saw earlier into housing units in the methodology? Because ultimately our methodology very quantitative, right? It's all numbers. And so we approached it by thinking about where are the areas in our region that are high opportunity. And by that I mean, where are the neighborhoods with the great schools, great amenities, strong access to jobs, low pollution burden? Well, these are the places where a child really has a chance to thrive if you grow up there. And if we're serious about affirmatively furthering fair housing, these are the places where it actually makes a lot of sense to try to build more affordable housing so that everyone can actually access that opportunity. So we worked with our stakeholders, including the housing planners from at the local level, to look at all of the indicators, and we eventually settled on using an adapted version of what are called the opportunity area maps that are created by the state. And these maps essentially give every census tract across the state a score. And that score is based on economic, environmental, educational metrics. And the top tracks are, with the highest index scores are considered to be high opportunity. So I know nobody signed up to do any math today. I won't go through the formulas at all. But we do, we took these high opportunity areas and we devised an adjustment factor in our methodology that said, if a jurisdiction has more of their existing housing in these high opportunity areas, they would get an upward adjustment of affordable units, which means they would need to zone for more higher densities in their housing element. So more high opportunity means zoning for more affordable housing types. The map on the right shows how that exercise shook out, with the greener the jurisdiction, the more high opportunity it is. The SACOG board adopted this approach last year, and it's already been imitated by other regions throughout the state. As I mentioned, we were sort of the first, others sort of followed our lead. In fact, it's been lauded by an independent research group as the best actually in the state on this particular objective. Of course, though, that methodology was just to figure out how much each jurisdiction should be planning for. The actual implementation of that happens at the local level, right? Local governments have land use authority. And so the housing element is where a lot of this kind of the rubber hits the road. It's happening as we speak. It must be adopted. Your local housing elements, you've probably already heard from your staff. If not, you will soon, that they will be adopted by May. And local governments are also going to be grappling with this new requirement to affirmatively further fair housing in your housing elements. So you will be hearing more about this idea from your local staff as that planning process nears adoption. So that was a very brief overview of how SACOG is already engaged on this intersection between housing policy and racial inequality. Like I mentioned at the top, you will have an opportunity to dig much deeper into this topic at our board workshop later this month with Stephen Menendian. At this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, particularly on the RENA methodology. If you have sort of larger questions around some of the research, we'd be happy to take notes and pass those on to Dr. Menendian so that he can sort of cover that in more detail at the board workshop. But I'll turn it back to you, Chair Galdo. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. I see we have some questions. We'll start with Director Frost.
Chair Galdo, I was wondering, Dov, if it's possible to get the redlining map like for our entire county.
Yeah, so the redlining map that I showed on the presentation, believe it or not, is basically the extent of what we have from the redlining maps. Much of our region outside of that area didn't actually exist when they were creating the maps. So that is, there may be other ones, but they don't have them sort of digitized. But there is a really interesting sort of website that has digitized all of the existing redlining maps across the country that we'd be happy to send you a link if you're interested.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was a lot to go. Any other questions? James, were you going to contribute? I hear your voice.
Well, I'm sure Dov will send this around. And I think too, Dov, that Dr. Menendian will say a little bit of this. A lot of his research will come from the Bay Area. I know you all like to get, within Sacramento, the Sacramento region or other parts of California. But having been a former resident, I can tell you in Oakland, California, there was a lot of redlining maps throughout California and in the Bay Area in particular. So I'm sure that Dov can get you some of those, which is pretty interesting. And I lived my first house in Oakland, California, right on Lake Merritt. It was one of the few places that allowed people of color to own property very early on, because the larger landowner who had that piece of property was very intentional about allowing people of color to buy land there, contrary to what was happening all around. And it still is one of the most mixed race communities around downtown Oakland.
I think that was such a great overview, and it's just so interesting what we can learn from what you just went through with us. I know the same thing in Rockland. I know when my husband's grandparents both immigrated here from Spain. We had 500 people, and it was an incredibly diverse community. It was Finnish, Spanish, Chinese, Irish, very, very diverse community, and went through massive changes when the railroad was in Rockland originally, and then it moved to Roseville, and they literally picked up the houses and moved them down the street to move them to Roseville, and made major changes. So it's so fascinating. I think the one piece I noticed in there that is important to me too is the fact that women couldn't get a mortgage to buy a home on their own at about the same time, because they would not have been reliable earners at that time. So I think that's another piece that would be important to include. Any other questions from our directors? I know that was a lot to take in, but what a great overview. I'm not seeing any hands raised. Thank you very much, Doug. We look forward to the next one. And then it looks like, Dov, you're going to stay with us. So you've got the next item on minding the gap.
I do, yeah, I'd be happy to jump into that. So hello again. This item is to provide a preview of SACOG's Mind the Gap housing initiative that will be standing up this year. Between the housing elements and being due this year and the unprecedented amount of state funding that's available for housing planning this year, 2021 is actually shaping up to be a big year for housing. It was sort of mentioned at the top, but it really is a sort of unique opportunity that we have this year. Of course, the need is enormous. We have a substantial need to build more housing overall, and in particular, more attached housing products in our infill areas. We just talked about some of the equity considerations, but there are a whole suite of reasons why we as a region have an interest in building more housing, from our climate goals to affordability to economic prosperity. So as a means of supporting our member agencies to see the new housing we need, we are launching a housing initiative this year. It's called Mind the Gap. You should have all received a 2-page pamphlet from Lynette yesterday. It might not have been in your packets, but check your emails if you don't have it in front of you. It came yesterday afternoon. It lays out what this initiative is all about. It includes some background on the housing gaps that we're experiencing, a handful of policies that local governments can pursue to help fill those gaps, and what SACOG can actually do to help get you there. I'm not going to go into the detail today, but we just wanted to provide the pamphlet early just to get the wheels turning, and then we'll come back to you all next month to talk through more of the content in that pamphlet and what we can do in 2021. So that's all I have for this item for now, but happy to take any initial thoughts as this effort takes shape.
Thank you. Any questions on this item? I have not seen any hands. Jane, oh, I do see a hand, Director Gore.
Thank you. You know, I really appreciate this flyer, and I think that as we're looking at housing this year, it really strikes me when I look at the cost of housing, the burden of housing for families, right? And how many families pay above, gosh, 30 or 50% more of their income for housing, right? And as we look at the shortage of housing in our communities, it's so important that we look at how do we provide a diversity of housing, smaller homes, attached homes, being creative with this, because we clearly have not enough housing in our community. And then when you look at how expensive it is for our families, it really sort of, I want to share that it really sobers me, because I think we've got to do better for our residents. And I certainly want my kids to be able to live here, you know, so that my grandkids live here in the future. So I think that I really appreciate SACOG looking at this and looking at, as we start trying to see how our own communities can maybe utilize some of these tools that SACOG can help us with, as we're looking at trying to meet these RENA numbers in the future, right? Because we're supposed to zone for it, but I think we as jurisdictions can also help encourage different types of production if we provide additional tools or different, if we get creative on how we do this. So I just, I really appreciate it. I appreciate SACOG's available to help us as we're trying to address these issues in our own communities.
Thank you. I think for me, one of the most important pieces of information I had was we did the cap to cap was that tour, and we got to go out and look. And I think we were in Maryland at that community with literally $1 million homes, with the smaller townhomes with the Paseo kind of in there, and it all blend in so beautifully. It's not like you noticed or felt it was different. And I think that's just a comfort zone we can get to. And on that note, James, do we have any thoughts about cap to cap again?
Oh boy, that's my crystal ball you're asking me to see and look into. I know there won't be a cap to cap this year, and I that's what I believe anyway. I'm not sure, at least not the spring, the typical kind of spring trip. I'm not sure if anybody else knows. I don't think there's going to be one in the fall, and I can only hope that we'll do a spring 22. But while you say that, and I do want to, for all our new board members, we've done some great board trips, just the SACOG board, and Chair Gore and I have talked about if we could do something that would be, COVID friendly, even going down to say there's on Mare Island in Vallejo, there's a modular housing factory, which I think is fascinating, where they're mass producing modular housing. It's actually a labor workforce, skilled and trained workforce. If we could get down there this year and do something like that, that's maybe a little closer to home. We went to San Diego. Some of you remember the trip we took down there last January before COVID, and that was, I think, really eye-opening for many. So cap to cap's a good opportunity, but maybe we can also think about something closer to home. And again, I promise I won't talk so much in future committee meetings, but if you were wondering, you're listening to Dob on the previous presentation, you were hearing about the history of redlining and what government did to actually suppress home ownership and housing, especially for people of color. And your question, and I think Dob answered in that presentation, right? But is, well, what do we do? Why is this meaningful? What do I do about it as a local elected official? This 2-pager is your answer, right? This is a year of housing. Housing elements are due. You have to update them all across the region. We're here to help you. We got a great staff. You've got, I know, got very good staff, but who are pretty stretched. So as Chair Gore said, what does it look like to be really creative? What does it look like to push the envelope? What does it look like to welcome housing into our communities for all income levels and to reverse some of these racial wealth gaps and racial disparities? We're also very open and willing to come to your city councils and your board of supervisors and do presentations on this. And we're looking also to work with some of our business partners and specifically the Metro Chamber to help when you have a tough decision or a tough vote on housing policy. And you got a lot of people going to show up and say, we don't want apartments or we don't want housing. Let us figure out how we can help you get some voices, the YIMBYs, the yes in my backyards, to come help provide some of that support for you at a local level.
Thank you, James. Chair Gore.
Just to follow up on that, because I'm looking at Jan, and they had a housing development and the residents voted against it, right? And they have a need for housing. And I think that one of the things that we might consider talking about, James, as a toolkit for jurisdictions is how do you engage the community in these conversations so that they understand the value ahead of time before a jurisdiction takes a vote, which may end up becoming more controversial, right? The one thing I've learned, I'm dealing with some sort of possible affordable housing in the city of Roseville, and we're having to really work with the local neighbors to get them to understand it's not Section 8 housing, it's workforce housing. What does that look like? It looks nice. And we're having to do a whole lot of community outreach ahead of time before we even get to saying, hey, here's this great product, right? So I think those might be things that we can assist or look at. How do we help people communicate ahead of time before a jurisdiction gets to a vote on a project that could be controversial, I guess, or a different type of product than they're used to.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this item? I know we'll have a lot down the road, so thank you all. Appreciate the information. We have made it through our agenda, and so if there are any other items that, anything for the good of the order, any other questions on any other items or suggestions? We're all still up and we're ready. We got this. So thank you. This is going to be a fun year for us. It'll definitely be exciting. I appreciate all the help and support and definitely the overviews, and look forward to seeing you all in person one day. If not, nothing else, then we are adjourned.
Thank you, Jill.
Great job, Chair Gallardo.
Thank you.